I think one of the most complicated and continuous strategic decisions that you have to make as like a deep tech startup company is that you have to find ways to demonstrate your technology to customers and put your technology in the hands of customers before that technology is fully developed. How to design those demonstration studies and evaluation studies, et cetera, in order to do that in the way that not only demonstrates the value of your product, but also shows what you really still need to work on to make this a fully fledged product, does require extremely nuanced understanding of the system as a whole. It would be very difficult or impossible to make the right decisions there without that technical understanding.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Jared O'Leary, the co-founder and CEO of SirenOpt, and Ali Mesbah, his co-founder and also his former Ph.D. advisor. Ali is a professor of chemical engineering at UC Berkeley. SirenOpt is a Berkeley spin-out that is solving one of manufacturing's biggest blind spots. Their PlasmaSens platform uses cold atmospheric plasma and AI to non-destructively inspect thin films and nanomaterials in real time, catching defects and inconsistencies that traditional methods miss entirely. They're helping manufacturers of batteries, semiconductors, and aerospace components accelerate R&D, optimize production, and dramatically improve quality control. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about how the industry currently solves the problem and how SirenOpt is revolutionizing the space. Then we deep dive into the technology. We look into the origins of the startup from research at UC Berkeley, customer discovery, especially the importance of relationship building during this process, and how it is different from just interviewing potential customers, lessons from working with the industry and their fundraising journey, and also many other topics, including Jared's experience working at Theranos. I really enjoyed this conversation with Jared and Ali, and I hope you will find this useful. Jared, let's set the stage by talking about the problem you guys are solving at SirenOpt. But before that, what's up with the name?
SirenOpt is basically a play on the term safe optimization, which is a summary of our core academic and controls expertise. Really a reference to the fact that a core goal of what we are making is to make factories operate in more efficient and safer ways. And the reason we use siren as a play on safe is that there's sirens inside of factories.
What are these problems that you're talking about in these industries?
The core problem we're trying to solve is that advanced coatings and thin films and micro and nanoscale materials are critical components in a huge number of industries that underpin the global economy. So they are key components in batteries and semiconductors, jet engines, gas turbines, etc. This entire class of materials does share a common problem, which is that manufacturing these materials can be considered inherently probabilistic. And what I mean by that is that even under identical operating conditions, the manufactured products will sort of always exist on some sort of distribution, with some products being low quality, many products being medium quality, and some products being very high quality. One reason for this is there's basically a very limited amount of information that manufacturers can gather about these materials in real time inside of high volume manufacturing. And we are providing a unique hardware and software solution that can not only gather this very critical and otherwise unobtainable information, but can also give manufacturers the ability to act on that information. To give a couple of examples here, one very good use case for us is measuring the quality of battery electrodes. If you're not familiar with how battery electrodes are manufactured, basically what happens is you start with like a big vat of what is called a slurry, which is, effectively this sort of non-homogeneous mixture of like active particle and binders and solvent, etc. And then to manufacture the battery, the electrode, what happens is that that slurry is basically pressed onto foil that is moving between what you can imagine as two big paper towel rolls moving at like 100 meters a minute. That slurry is pressed, it's dried, and it's basically pressed again. The critical properties of the electrode that you want to measure are the thickness, the density, the resistivity, the chemical composition, identifying certain edge defects, identifying certain contaminants inside the bulk of the material, etc. So right now, inside of manufacturing lines, really what is generally only measured is the thickness of the electrode. There's certain optical methods that can also find some types of defects and surface contaminants, but all of the other properties that I sort of mentioned cannot be measured. And then so our tool can measure all of the properties I just mentioned kind of in parallel, in real time, and inside of these high volume manufacturing. So to give a more concrete example, something we demonstrated recently, which is very encouraging, is that actually these battery electrodes, they can get metallic contaminants from the battery manufacturing equipment inside of the bulk of the electrode material. These metallic contaminants are really small. I mean, they're like 50 microns or even smaller. And if those contaminants are not caught, they can be a number one cause of battery fires. So you can imagine if there's no way to identify the presence of those contaminants inside of these electrode materials, like in real time, puts your manufacturing operation at risk of having, battery fires or other sort of safety issues.
What do the manufacturers do today? What are the current solutions?
Current solutions basically use a combination of like X-ray and optical methods to measure a subset of properties in line, the thickness, or maybe some surface contaminant or some surface defect. The remaining properties, like identifying metallic contaminants in the bulk of materials or things like resistivity or chemical composition, etc., those are measured by manufacturers cutting off a small portion of the material and then measuring them offline. But in those circumstances, they're really measuring significantly less than 1% of the materials being manufactured.
Ali, what are you guys doing specifically to address this question in terms of technology?
Our technology relies on cold atmospheric plasmas. So in particular, what SirenOpt does, we are developing this sensor that relies on measuring the plasma material coupling. There are a couple of very important questions here. Number one, how to maintain plasma in a desired state in order to avoid inflicting any damage on the material. So if you're making advances on plasma control, which is the core expertise of myself and my lab, my research lab at UC Berkeley, that is one primary question. The other question boils down to how to decipher the wealth of data that we collect from these plasma surface interactions. So we are combining advanced machine learning tools with our physics knowledge of these plasma surface interactions to be able to essentially analyze data in real time in order to make multiple property predictions.
Before we go deeper into this technology aspect, in simple terms, maybe you can explain what this cold plasma is about, cold atmospheric plasma.
So plasmas are the fourth state of matter. Basically, if you take gas and if you ionize it, meaning that if you apply electric fields, you would be able to generate plasmas. In particular, cold atmospheric plasmas are weakly ionized gases, meaning that they have a background temperature close to the room temperature, while they also embody very high energy electrons. And this is what gives rise to very interesting medium, highly reactive medium in the context of materials processing and, in our case, metrology.
It's relatively cold, about 40 degrees, barely above body temperature. It's at normal atmospheric pressure.
Exactly. Yeah. These are atmospheric pressure plasmas.
And it's gentle enough to touch material without damaging them, but energetic enough that when it interacts with the material, interesting things are happening that you can measure. Jared, you mentioned current manufacturers don't have anything more than thickness that they measure or use X-rays to detect some metallic impurities. What exactly are you guys measuring using cold plasma?
First of all, I just want to say, like, the example I gave about thickness and optical based methods, that was kind of purely for batteries. There's other sorts of types of manufacturing that measure those sorts of things in line, et cetera. What we actually measure for each customer is a lot of times different. We really position ourselves by asking each customer, what do you wish you could measure inside of high volume manufacturing lines that you cannot measure today? And sometimes the answer to that is a simultaneous measurement of thickness, density, resistivity. Sometimes that is a chemical composition measurement. Sometimes that is identifying a certain type of defect, maybe a debonding or delamination defect. Sometimes that's identifying a certain class of contaminant. But something that I want to make very clear is, from a purely technological standpoint, the way our sensor measures all of these properties is identical from application to application. The core mechanism is that we sort of sensor collects raw data, and that raw data is the same regardless of the application. And then it uses a physics-informed machine learning model to sort of translate that raw data into whatever property the customer likes. And the customer can train and calibrate that model automatically and by themselves and without us. And the process to sort of calibrate that model for whatever property is identical.
You mentioned something about physics-enabled machine language. Can you dig more into that?
So when we say physics-informed machine learning, one, let's just be very careful how we define the term machine learning. So I define it as any data-driven model. There's some inputs and then there's some outputs, and there's a data-driven method to predict those outputs from that input. When I say physics-informed machine learning, I talk about directly incorporating some physics or domain knowledge into that calibration procedure. And we basically have specialized physical knowledge of these plasmas that are directly incorporated into these training procedures.
That helps set the stage for the audience to understand what problem that you're trying to solve here. Let's go back to the basics. How did you two end up working together on this one?
Jared was a graduate student in my lab. He was working on optimal control of stochastic and uncertain processes. He was a very motivated student, obviously. And toward the end of his Ph.D., he made significant progress towards modeling and control of these types of uncertain processes. Closer to the end of his Ph.D., I gave him an assignment to start looking into plasma problems, which was a major application area in my lab. Accidentally, we came across this invention that through measuring these plasma surface interactions and coupling those measurements with the sorts of machine learning tools that Jared was developing at the time, we could learn about the material itself. And that basically led to a couple of inventions and the creation of SirenOpt.
You were a professor at Berkeley when you were doing this. Was cold plasma always your research topic, or it's one of these things that got you interested?
Interestingly not. Basically, I got drawn to the area of cold atmospheric plasmas around 2015. So when I was a young assistant professor joining UC Berkeley Department of Chemical Engineering, one of my colleagues got me interested in this area. And then we started working on advanced control of biomedical plasma devices. And this is how I got into this area. In fact, my lab pioneered the application of machine learning and optimal control methods to biomedical cold atmospheric plasmas. And then we extended that towards metrology. And now we have pivoted to other types of plasma applications.
So, Jared, what was the project like when you guys were working on the cold plasma? Was it like a medical application?
Yeah, it actually was a medical application. People do see a lot of potential in using cold plasmas to modify various types of incident materials. And one potential, or at least hot application of that, really is things like wound healing and skin cancer treatment. One of the core problems we were trying to solve was that if I'm sort of using a cold plasma to modify a surface, and imagine I have a handheld plasma jet, and I'm a doctor and I'm treating some patient and my hand is moving and the environment is variable, how do I ensure that that plasma behaves consistently? We're able to demonstrate that we could create these sort of embedded feedback control algorithms that could allow the plasma to be constant regardless of what's going on in the environment. Over the course of that research, we also realized that we could maintain that plasma at a low enough energy where it did not actually modify the surface, where it actually interacted with the surface in a sort of non-destructive way. And then once we realized that and understood that there's a lot of information in these resulting plasma and material interactions, the idea of this being this system turning into a sensing system.
How do you control the plasma to make it consistent and predictable? It must not be an easy problem, Ali. What was the status before and what did you crack to get to this consistency?
Plasmas have been widely used in semiconductor industry multiple decades. The same type of plasmas known as non-equilibrium plasmas. So cold atmospheric plasmas is kind of a class of non-equilibrium plasmas. So the problem of plasma control in the context of semiconductor manufacturing is a fairly well-known and well-studied problem. In the context of atmospheric pressure plasmas, which is what we're doing, it's a different problem in the sense that the susceptibility to disturbances and variabilities, as Jared mentioned, are much more pronounced. In terms of the approaches that we took, we really went back to the fundamentals, optimal control and optimization. We tried to take a very rigorous approach to plasma control, meaning that we try to formulate the problem as a mathematical optimization problem that embodied the knowledge of material or plasma itself in terms of mathematical models. And then we did a series of technical developments on solving these sophisticated optimization problems in real time. That was our core contribution, first in real time and then on embedded systems. By embedded, I mean resource-constrained hardware, like system-on-a-chip kind of hardware and FPGA systems. Those were the core developments that we did, and then we later combined those advances with machine learning and deep learning to be able to close the loop, meaning that we analyze real-time sensor data and push these problems to the next level.
And this was happening 2015, I think you mentioned, when you got into cold plasma.
2015 to 2021, 2022. So I have trained 2 or 3 generations of graduate students in this area.
Jared, when did you join the lab? You joined as a PhD student. What attracted you to Ali's lab? Was it the fundamental research problem or something else?
I joined Ali's lab in 2016. So first, when you choose a research lab, there's sort of multiple tiers. So the first thing that I was pretty convinced on is that I did want to join a lab that was more computationally focused. I'd been in industry for a few years, and I felt that the people I'd met who had PhDs who were in more computational labs actually were better thinkers because they thought about things generally in a more theoretical based level. Whereas certain people who I'd met who had done more experimental PhDs were kind of more trained to run and design a bunch of different types of experiments, but not really to have this kind of fundamental systems understanding. That was the first aspect. The second aspect, out of things you can do computationally in research, there's a lot of applications that are maybe more pure modeling, applications that are maybe more pure simulation. But I was very interested and sort of attracted to the ability to sort of create algorithms or create software that actively made decisions and that made decisions in a way that was better or in situations that like humans could not do so. That is what attracted me to the idea of Ali's lab. And then I met Ali and I got along. And I also did like the fact that I joined the lab when Ali was a relatively new professor, because I also felt that new professors would maybe do things that were more different or more daring or more risky.
It looks like it worked out. And maybe I can call this a very PhD mindset when you first started. Walk me through what you were actually doing day to day. What did this research look like when you started? When did the application in the real world come into picture?
The beginning of my PhD really focused broadly on multiple different types of these sort of uncertain or stochastic molecular processes. There are certain processes that I think we tried to model naively in the beginning that was sort of unsuccessful. We sort of made the realization, which is very relevant to what we do now at SirenOpt, that it's actually very complicated to properly characterize these types of molecular systems. So then we actually put a lot of effort into sort of novel, unsupervised learning-based ways to characterize systems. We made more progress there. Then we started looking, I understand too, 2016, 2017, 2018. This is kind of when machine learning tools are also becoming much more available and much more usable to students. I don't know when TensorFlow and PyTorch came out, but they were certainly getting popular around that time. We also kind of benefited from the fact that these very advanced computational tools now had a much lower barrier to entry. And someone like myself, who's not formally trained as a computer scientist or anything, and as a chemical engineer, could now begin to really investigate these types of tools for chemical application. Progress through that, looking at different types of control and modeling and characterization for different systems, and eventually, towards the end, started looking into this plasma problem.
You're basically developing these feedback control algorithms, and you realize you can create very consistent, very stable plasma at low energy. That's interesting from a control systems perspective. How did you make that leap to this? Could be a sensor, Ali.
It was pretty interesting, actually, in our control work as we were validating these advanced control algorithms. One day we took a step back and we look at the detector data that we were collecting. And these are very simple off-the-shelf detectors. And it was only then that, again, very randomly, we realized that there are signatures of the material appearing in those detectors. And as Jared mentioned, initially we couldn't fully analyze the raw data. We had to do a lot of characterization work using these unsupervised learning methods and so on and so forth to be able to pick up the fingerprints of materials. But that was the inception of this idea.
You're seeing this information-rich interactions between the plasma and the material. The plasma touches the material responds.
And then we try to connect basically the fingerprints that we were kind of observing in data to the physics. There's this very complex interplay feedback between the material and plasma. It's very rich in terms of chemical response, thermal response, and electrical response as well. That was the start.
Like all of us, we spend so much time in the research labs. We see so much failures. What was that moment you looked at the data and thought this actually works?
It was change in the perspective. Instead of trying to realize the desired response on the material, we decided to understand how the material was responding to plasma. So that change in perspective was very revealing.
Jared, like you're a PhD student. You could have just written up this paper, graduate, move on. And Ali, you could have had another grad student continue the research project. Why did you think this needs to be a company?
I don't think I thought, this needs to be a company initially. Ali and I saw like a massive opportunity here and a unique opportunity. And from my perspective, an opportunity that was large enough where I think I very fairly said to myself that I'm never going to have an opportunity like this again. From that perspective, I really enjoyed working with Ali. And I thought to myself, hey, work with Ali for 6 years. What's another couple of years here, right?
Not 5 years, 6 years.
At least in the beginning of this company, for the first year, I never expected it to last beyond like 90 days from like where I was. Got to try this. But if this doesn't work out, there's still time. The last year or so is really the first time I've been truly thinking about the company in a very long-term perspective. Because before it seemed sort of unreasonable to think about it long-term, but now, we've made enough progress and we demonstrated enough things where I spend a lot of time thinking like, what is the company 2 years from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, etc. That mindset shift has also been very interesting for me.
What were your initial conversations like? So you have this technology, and who did you start talking to validate that there's some potential?
We started talking to anyone that we thought could manufacture some sort of advanced material. The first application that we thought would be really good for this were actually these applications of like medical implants. Medical implants do have these protective coatings that are sort of very important for how the implant is inside the body, how long it lasts, and things of this sort. And actually, an interesting piece of feedback we got in the beginning was that we talked to these companies that make medical implants and things like that, and we asked them about their quality control processes. And they actually said they don't do any post-deposition quality control because the FDA does not require it. We began talking to different people in semiconductor, different people in batteries, and the kind of most immediate traction we got or interest that we got were people trying to make lithium-ion batteries. Because you have to understand 2022, 2023, lithium-ion battery manufacturing is kind of ramping up in the US. It's new, it's hard, and people are kind of more desperate, for lack of a better term, to like know more about their processes. As we have become more legitimate, we have now been able to speak with older industries. We have customers that make jet engines. We have customers that make gas turbines, big old industrial companies who would not have spoken to us when we were a 2-person startup, but now are.
The initial focus was on medical devices applications. Were you biased going to that industry first? And are there any dots you connected about how an industry is much better in terms of opening to new technologies as opposed to others? What did you guys learn in that process?
We were pretty open-minded in terms of the target industries. Definitely some industries are much harder to get into. They're conservative for good reasons. Semiconductor industry, for example, biotech to some degree. But we were very open-minded. And in fact, we were kind of exploring multiple avenues at once. And in fact, after a couple of years, after 3-4 years, some of those early collaborations that we set up are coming to fruition at this point.
Ali, I completely agree with being open-minded, especially in the early stages of market exploration. I want to slightly shift gears and get to Jared about his experience working at Theranos, where you worked from 2013 to 2016 before you started your PhD. What was it like working at Theranos?
I actually really enjoyed my time at Theranos. A lot of really smart people there, and especially when you're young, your first job out of college, and you work around a lot of smart people that are working on an interesting problem, and where you also effectively have like zero budget for the engineering things you can buy. It's actually pretty fun. One thing that was very obvious there was that the leadership at Theranos really had no understanding at all of the core technology. One big discrepancy, I think Theranos is very famous for claiming that they had technology that could do 300 blood tests on a drop of blood or something like that. But there was no one in the company who was working on that problem. We were trying to work on basically having individual panels of like 15 to 20 tests on a sort of drop of blood. The thing that I recognized as off was this sort of discrepancy, this sort of lack of fundamental understanding of the technology by the leadership. But really what encouraged me to leave Theranos, because I really did leave Theranos during the height of Theranos, was the fact that I was lucky enough to be on this team with all these PhDs who I just felt were much smarter than me. And Ali knows this because he read my application essay to Berkeley. But my essay was basically formulated as I work at this company with all these PhDs. They're all smarter than me. I just want to be smarter. So I'm very, very thankful for Theranos for actually exposing me to that, because it was very eye-opening for me to sit around with people who had PhDs and watch us look at the exact same problem with the exact same information, and that they could break down that problem in just significantly better ways than I could. It was really there where I realized that like there's a really big gap in like how I can think, and I want to reach my potential. I really want to be able to think in that systematic way.
I'm sure it was a very valuable experience. Are there any specific anti-patterns from Theranos that you consciously avoided SirenOpt? Any specific examples of things we do X because Theranos didn't?
A huge problem with Theranos was something that fundamentally we cannot have, because Ali and I fundamentally understand the core technology. It's not like I had a lot of visibility into what was going on there. I worked there when I was like 22 to 24 years old. I didn't do anything particularly important.
I think what is very important is the leadership of a company, of a startup company, has a very intimate understanding and knowledge of that technology, the product that they're developing and commercialize. I think that is extremely important. Jared's very well aware of pretty much all the technical developments. And we have a very complex product in terms of it involves hardware, software, integrated system, and so on and so forth. And I think this intimate knowledge has come to his help tremendously.
I think one of the most complicated and continuous strategic decisions that you have to make as like a deep tech startup company is that you have to find ways to demonstrate your technology to customers and put your technology in the hands of customers before that technology is fully developed. How to design those demonstration studies and evaluation studies, etc., in order to do that in the way that not only demonstrates the value of your product, but also shows what you really still need to work on to make this a fully fledged product, does require extremely nuanced understanding of the system as a whole. It would be very difficult or impossible to make the right decisions there without that technical understanding.
Especially in the deep tech space, the transparency and proving that technology actually works before you make claims, and the technical rigor and not overpromising. These are fundamentals, and This is fascinating because what you're describing is almost the opposite of fake it till you make it, which is, I think, a big cultural aspect in Silicon Valley that you see.
That's because most people in Silicon Valley really are not selling to the types of large industrial companies that we are selling to. There's a lot of nuance there and a lot of diligence that goes into building that trust. One of our best partners is a major Japanese manufacturer. They visited our lab 5 separate times over the course of a year. I think we exchanged 120 plus emails before we even did one $5,000 paid pilot. And then after that $5,000 paid pilot, which is nothing, they asked for all of our raw data, which we sent them, which they then analyzed for like 3 or 4 months. After that, then they were really ready to go. But that took an enormous amount of time.
We talked about this earlier when you mentioned about how you're transparent about everything. Keep it open, come check out the technology. We're not going to lie about anything. These are our capabilities. That honesty is so important in this space.
I do think we are extra transparent into the inner workings of our technology. And I think that does build trust among our customers. There are a lot of companies who are very afraid that if they are too open, their technology will be stolen or X, Y, and Z. Philosophically, where I stand is that I will risk being more open to build more trust with the customer.
Ali, from your perspective as an academic, this culture of proving things rigorously before making claims, that's just how science works. You can't publish results without peer review, and you can't make claims without data. Did that academic mindset help create the right culture at SirenOpt?
Definitely. This is the culture that we have cultivated. And in fact, we're promoting actively with our new hires and so on. The approach that we took at SirenOpt, we strongly advocated for creation of very strong R&D teams, both on hardware and software, which are tasked to basically do the due diligence, to figure things out, openly discuss things first within the team, within the leadership, and then our clients. So it takes time and effort to cultivate this culture, but it is extremely important and instrumental.
That is a function of coming out of an academic environment. So I think when you're in academia, you are very well trained to be very careful and precise with your language. I would never say X, Y, and Z works because it's an imprecise statement. I would say X, Y, and Z does A, B, and C under E, F, and G conditions. Enforcing that level of thinking makes it just actually easier to do research and to advance and to progress technically.
It took us some time and effort to impart this way of thinking to our first generation of employees. It wasn't trivial.
Let's get back to the story. You have the proof of concept, the technology works, and you have consciously built a culture around scientific rigor. Now we need to figure out, is there a market for this? Tell us about that story, realizing the market, what the initial conversations were, any assumptions that you made, what actually happened in terms of going after the first market, what happened with the first market.
I think initially, when we had a little proof of concept and we decided to start the company, we broadly understood that there was a large opportunity. Just based on our experience with controls and sort of advanced manufacturing, and really a lot of Ali's experience in like advanced materials manufacturing. We did not have any real concept of understanding what a venture size market would, but we knew the market was quote unquote big. As Ali mentioned before, we have been very open. We always talk to new and potential customers all the time, and we have discovered progressively more and larger and more valuable use cases for this over time. All of our most enthusiastic initial traction was really from Bay Area battery startup companies. And that was largely because they're new in manufacturing and they want to know more information about what's going on. As we became more legitimate, we then sort of expanded the types of customers that we could interact with to include big, large industrial, traditionally conservative players in places outside of battery, including semiconductor, including aerospace, including power generation. How we have identified our first 2 target markets are not actually by the end application. They're actually for the type of manufacturing equipment used. And that's a very intentional choice for us because the type of manufacturing equipment used dictates what our sensor is and also have very, very similar problems. So just to give an example, say one of our first target market is what's called roll-to-roll manufacturing processes. So that's relevant for battery electrodes, but that's also relevant for fuel cell electrodes. Fuel cell electrodes and battery electrodes oftentimes have the exact same problems in these manufacturing processes, and oftentimes are even the same materials. It's a balance between customer enthusiasm or current technical capabilities, and then the sort of bureaucratic, for lack of a better term, barriers for implementation. So for us, those kind of first two target markets that make most sense are roll-to-roll manufacturing processes like batteries, fuel cells, various types of electronics, and what we call piece-to-piece manufacturing processes, which are things like turbine blades, automotive parts, etc. Something like semiconductor wafers has to be a little later stage for us because in order to measure those wafers, we have to build a type of machine that meets certain semi-standards, which takes time and effort.
How long was this customer discovery process? I know you've gone through the NSFI core. That's a very short, intense program. Is this something that you learned in that process? When did you realize about all these problems and how long did it take?
We are constantly performing customer discovery. Yeah. The sort of notion that you go through some ICOR program and you talk to 50 or whatever it is, and then you have a good understanding of your market is very naive. I think a lot of people think understanding the market is some reasonably defensible value of like a TAM and SAM and SOM or something, and that's not really understand the market. You have to understand how the things you're making are even purchased. What is all the nuance with that? Who is actually making the purchasing decision? Once they make the purchasing decision, how do you actually even get the money? What is the service? What is the installation? All of the logistical aspects that go into making a sale. So I think that process is constant. And I think too, there's a general misconception that it's possible to completely define your market. A lot of times investors ask us, okay, well, like how much would you improve the yield of a certain process? No customer is ever going to tell us how much we improve that. That's an impossible piece of information to get. It's a constant process.
It's easy to ask a silly question like that. Is it going to go 10x, 100x? How do you respond to investors like that?
Exactly as I respond to you. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how much yield you save or whatever. It really matters what you can sell it for. With X resources, how many tools can you sell at what price and to whom? And so it's really about getting an answer to that question. So just a constant question.
It's important for people to understand what customer discovery is and the aspect of relational building over a period of time.
So I think a lot of people define customer discovery as they call someone, they say, hey, would you want this? And people say, yeah, for sure. But it's like, do you want it enough to advocate to your manager to devote resources to this and stake some of your internal reputation on how much this is going to improve your process and be willing to pay a significant amount for a device that is not yet certified and definitely will need improvement and give us the proper feedback and really work with us for this? And that is the relationship building exercise. It's a little different maybe with people in software where if I make a new software product, the effort required to try it out is minimal. The first time ChatGPT came out, I could just go to chatgpt.com and ask it a question. That's almost no effort for us. There's an incredible amount of effort and time and resources used to test out our technology. And you're not going to put that time and effort and resources unless you've built a relationship with it.
Ali, you've been in academia, but indirectly or directly, you are always talking to industry. Touch upon that relationship building and how important that has been in growing this company so far.
I, in particular, work very closely with industry. A lot of problems that I work on in my research lab are basically informed through these collaborations. I like to work in industry type problems in an academic setting to be able to really dig deep into these problems. But what is very important is to have the right perspective to these problems. At the end, this is about making, from my point of view, a systems work in practice. Again, this has been something that I try to impart to my students as well. They can learn all skills independently, pretty much. What is important that they take away is this systems thinking. And this systems thinking should be informed by real life problems that come from industry. So that's how I view it. Going back to SirenOpt, and in terms of your questions to Jared regarding customer discovery and so on, I was not really involved very closely, and Jared has been doing a phenomenal job from the onset. How I tried to support Jared in his efforts was to identify, again, from a more technical perspective, what areas, what industries we can get into. And I think the synergy there worked quite well for SirenOpt as well. And we try to be very open-minded here as well.
That open-mindedness is very important. I see people a lot of times do some small market discovery that's not a customer discovery that I wouldn't consider a customer discovery, and then sort of like stick to that. And it's like this constant process of talking to new customers and current customers and learning more about them, and then like really reevaluating what we're doing and making sure we're on the like right path.
Jared, you mentioned something about venture scale, and then you have all these markets that you looked at, and I think you started with batteries. How did you end up with that battery market? Was it that venture scalable market? Did any investor play a role in that process in selecting the battery?
The first customers who paid us were battery manufacturers. That was because they were the people who were the most desperate, for lack of a better term, to work with us. To sort of answer your question, is batteries in itself venture scalable? There are arguments on either side of it. Even the term venture scalable is sort of imprecise. The sort of minimum definition term that I have, can you make $100 million a year with roughly 3% market share? This is why, too, it's not like you can just demonstrate, okay, $100 million a year is the maximum revenue I could ever make, and that's it. And that's why it's very important for us to understand and to interact in as many possible markets as we can to demonstrate the size of this opportunity. And demonstrating the size of the opportunity is not just important for, raising money from venture. It's also important to sort of dictate strategically your own technical development. Something that I really did not appreciate early on here was how important, quote unquote, market analyses are for strategic, technical, and commercial development decisions. It is very hard to make the right commercial and technical development decisions if you're blind to the size of that market opportunity.
Ali, from your academic perspective, how do you think about market selection? Because in research, you can focus on multiple things at once, but in the startup, focus is everything.
Putting on my academic hat, what excites me most is the R&D opportunities that new markets bring about. Again, I try to support Jared's effort through identifying these technical challenges and opportunities that each market will bring about. And then we do the groundwork in terms of the development and research.
The sort of markets that we focus on in the beginning are basically roll to roll and piece to piece, which we chose very strategically, not only of their sizes, but also of like the overlap in their technical development. From the outside, it can look as if we are doing many more different things than we actually are. These projects were chosen very specifically. These projects were chosen very specifically and very intentionally to sort of produce the maximum commercial output for a given technical input.
As we get into these new markets, we always ensure that there is a great degree of commonality among our products. That is extremely important from a business development point of view as well.
When I first started reading about your guys' work, first thing that popped in my mind was semiconductors. Why this guy's not going after semiconductors? I'm sure you have a strategic reason for why you didn't, but it's a shiny new thing. We are at Berkeley, TSMC is across the Pacific. You have all the semiconductor equipment companies nearby. On paper, it would have been an obvious choice, but I'm sure people would have thrown more money at you. But what went on around that decision?
So we are actively engaged with multiple semiconductor companies. We have one of our tools in Taiwan right now being used actively for semiconductor applications. But semiconductor is like a very broad term. And when I brought up doing more semiconductor related things later, I said that because generally when people hear the term semiconductor, they think things at like the wafer level, which require devices that don't generate particles, require all these semi-standards, require this more major hardware investment. We work with a company right now using roll-to-roll manufacturing processes to make materials for semiconductor packaging. That's a good application for us. We are beginning to work with next generation things like power electronics. So we are broadly within semiconductor. The world of semiconductor metrology and semiconductor manufacturing is just very, very, very vast. And so the way that we will hit that market is through multiple applications over a longer period of time. And those first applications will be chosen by, again, a balance of what is the market opportunity, what is the technical lift to enter that market, what commercial relationships we've made so far.
The choice of words is super important. That's a major lesson I'm walking away with. What you mean when you say something is super important, and that clarity is something that everybody could keep in mind. Let's slightly shift gears and Ali mentioned about his academic hat. Most PhD students don't form a company with their advisors. There's this power imbalance, and Ali, you have a safe academic job. I see you as a CTO of the company. What time do you spend at Berkeley and how much time do you spend at the startup? What was the decision-making process like for you?
Up to this point, I've been involved in SirenOpt as an advisor, as a technical advisor. So I'm pretty much involved in the technical decisions made, but I do not have a formal position. I think from the start, there was this unwritten or unspoken division of labor between Jared and myself. We have complementary skills, and I think that helped a lot. I'm less interested maybe in some of the business development aspects, whereas Jared has been from the onset very much hands-on, leading those activities, whereas I try to push forward the technology from a more technical point of view. I think the balance from the start was just right. I do not remember, Jared, if you and I ever had a conversation about how to divide things up, division of labor, let's say. It was very organic, very natural.
It was pretty natural. I mean, I'm sure there were like more logistical conversations. There was never any conflict there.
But we both had very clear understanding of the strengths that we each have, and we tried to kind of leverage.
In academia, there's this existing relationship you had, and there are power dynamics. You're the professor, and he's a student. How did that transfer over? If there's a question about technology, and Jared is a CEO, who gets to have the final say on a technology question?
We never operated in that power dynamic way. Even when I was a grad student, I almost never remember any scenario where Ali was like, do this, and I just did it. One thing that I really liked about working with Ali is that we actually talked all the time in grad school. Very long discussions about a number of technical concepts. I don't really remember a time where I moved forward without some mutual buy-in from us.
I like to be proven incorrect.
The way in which we naturally operate is not, I'm just going to make a decision now. We will talk for a very long time about a number of different decisions. And I am also I think naturally very open to hear all sorts of different perspectives. I'm just interested in making the right decision, whatever that is.
There's no communication barriers between us. And I think this is very important, both in terms of accessibility and more importantly, hearing each other. And I have learned tremendously from Jared in this journey.
This podcast is about academic research moving to startups. I think that this trust should be built from the beginning, and this should be like a litmus test if you really want to start a company with your professor.
What I want to emphasize is, in our case, this has been extremely organic. It wasn't that we sat down and we set the rules. It has worked quite well.
Were there any disagreements between you two around the company?
Everyone disagrees all the time, but then you talk about it. If you're both reasonable, you'll come to some conclusion. Like I hear all the time about very bizarre stories about PhD students starting companies with their advisor, and there's some horrible disagreement that they can't get over. Again, I've not been in that, but my interpretation on the outside is that if there's something like that is happening, someone is just being ridiculously prideful or something, or irrational. If your number one goal is to commercialize this technology, if that is aligned, then everything else will follow.
That's a great way of thinking. Let's shift the gears, and I want to bring something about the fundraising part of it. How has the journey been in terms of fundraising? Like, what was the first dollar that came in? We had some open conversations about it, Jared, you and I, at some point. I wanted to hear about the journey. How much money did you raise so far?
The first dollar amount that we raised was from Berkeley Skydeck. That was a whopping $200,000, and that was transformative for the company. You need to ask yourself the question of like whether or not this is venture scalable. Because maybe you want to start a company and it's not venture scalable. That's fine. There's all sorts of other ways to fund companies with grants, et cetera, et cetera. That is the first question. The average person does not know what a roll-to-roll manufacturing machine is. The average person has never heard the term piece-to-piece manufacturing process. They don't know the term thermal barrier coating on jet turbine blade. When you deal in that unfamiliar region, it's really on you to not only know a lot about the market, but also be able to educate people about the market. I remember early on in this saying to some investor, hey, we make sensors for batteries and blah, blah, blah. And the person goes, oh, you make sensors for batteries, but don't they already manufacture batteries? Why would someone need a sensor? That's what you're dealing with. The things we've learned on the journey the most, the importance of the market, because if the market is not a certain opportunity, it's not worth that investor's time to learn more about the rest of your company. And then second is to really understand how to best demonstrate commercial traction, whether that's free pilots or paid pilots or POCs or deployments, etc. That's where the nuances. I think a lot of people do want to talk about why the technology is unique and why it's defensible, why it's hard to replicate. And those things are important. I'm not saying they're not, but they're less important than the first two.
You're a first-time founder. Looks like you had a pretty successful experience raising funds. What helped you raise money in this space?
Berkeley Skydeck was phenomenally helpful to us. They really coached us on a lot of our storytelling. They introduced us to a number of high-quality investors. Our first 6 months of existence, they really, quote unquote, showed us the ropes. We didn't really have enough traction to raise like a true seed round. So what we did instead was we raised these series of sort of these pre-seed safes that came in different chunks, amounts from $25,000 to like $1 million. It's not possible for us to raise the 5 million or so we want to raise right now immediately. But what could I do with 200,000? Or what could I do with 300,000? Or what could I do with 500,000? And where would that get me? Certain things are not on the table for me right now, but this other thing is on the table. How can I make the best of it? We did end up raising about $3 million in safes from our inception in Berkeley Skydeck until the fall after Berkeley Skydeck. And then that basically allowed us to get enough traction to then raise a formal priced $6.6 million seed round in July of 2024.
If there are three big learnings from being a part of Skydeck, what would that be?
One is just how powerful people's networks can be. There is a massive difference between cold calling someone on LinkedIn and having someone who maybe even be a tangential relation to someone introduced. The other thing that I think Skydeck did a really good job of is they really pushed me to make commercial traction. Every week it was like, why haven't you made more money? We have to talk to more customers. We have to get paid by these customers. It's very easy to exist in a spot where you think, oh, the customers will come later, or our technology will be good and they come later. So they really shifted that mindset for me.
And you're also part of Activate. What big takeaways are from that? We had both Activate and Skydeck on a podcast previously. I wanted to hear from your side as a founder.
So I would say Activate is very different. Activate is catered to supporting the fellows within Activate. Those fellows generally being people who go from Ph.D. to starting a company. But Activate is really catered to support the fellows within the bounds of the company or outside the bounds of the company. Skydeck is catered to put you in a position to raise money. There's programming at Activate that is very specifically chosen and wisely chosen for people like my background. And that was very, very, very helpful. They're just different programs. I think they're both great, and I would recommend anyone join them. The core difference is Activate, as it says, is a fellowship, supports its fellows, and Skydeck is an accelerator.
What has been the toughest part so far in your journey?
Every day is just hard in a different way.
Every day is challenging, obviously. But to give you one concrete example, I can say putting the right team has been challenging, especially early on when we did not have the right experience of product development. We are talking about a certified product. As a professor, I never had that experience. The first few hires were very critical. We did not have the right skills to identify the right hires. Those were challenging days.
Let's talk about that. I've seen some really experienced people on your team now. Maybe we can talk about that hiring process. What have you learned since you raised money and hiring these people?
So one of these is very hard to hire people outside of your core expertise. There's an interview skill with that you obviously learn over time. We'll use our advisors to interview people as well because we recognize the skill. We do have a lot of experience in our team, but that's largely because I don't think we realized how much experience was really necessary to solve some of these problems, particularly in nuanced like electrical problems. Sometimes you just need someone who's been around for 20 years because they've seen X, Y, and Z thing.
Does that question come up when you talk to the investors? Why can't a bigger company solve this problem and why you? How do you answer that question?
Not phrased like that. I think people ask why current methods cannot do what we can do? The answer to that is we can measure multiple properties at once inside a manufacturing lens. At the end of the day, current metrology techniques are designed to elicit a specific signal to measure one property. We have really turned that on its head, and we elicit a ton of signals and then use physics-informed machine learning to back out the properties. This is not how metrology is done or measurement is done today. And the reason we were able to discover something like that is really because of our unique background in cold plasmas, in machine learning, and in feedback control and data acquisition.
When you're hiring so many people, are there any questions that you're repeating now to determine if a candidate is a good fit? What exactly did you learn in that process? And how do you handle with people with so much more experience than you? How do you make a decision if something is right or wrong?
We also have various leads within our company who really lead, for lack of a better term, a lot of these interview processes and like who we trust.
Any hiring questions you ask? This is so important for me.
First of all, it is important that they have a vision, especially if they're within higher ranks within the company. And number two is if their visions are aligned with our vision. This vision alignment is also very important.
There's a vision alignment aspect. There's also an aspect of hiring people at like a seed stage company. When most people say they want to join a startup company, what they're thinking of is like a Series C or Series D, extremely well-funded company where they have free breakfast, lunch, and dinner and a gym on campus. That is very, very different than a scrappy seed stage company. So we do screen now for people that are specifically attracted to this type of environment.
And they believe in the idea. Extremely important. That is what we learned through experience. We give very elaborate demos of our technology. I very transparently discuss what we're capable of, what the potential pitfalls are. Then we see if they buy in.
That's super important. Like in the interview process, we were very transparent about a lot of the challenges and basically really say, is this interesting for you to try to solve these? But they do have to see the potential.
What have you found in the most interesting candidates? Is it that idea that they're coming to your company for? Because this is so high risk, so early in the game. What is bringing the best people to your company? I really like your team. So that's why I'm asking, like, how are you able to get some good candidates this early?
We were certainly more de-risked than we were early on. But at the end of the day, how do you convince people? Well, some people we hired just love startups. We just hired a new head of software who's great, and he's been at 5 really small startups. Some people like that. Some people just think the idea in itself is really unique. So it's different for every person.
You mentioned earlier that now you start thinking long term, 2, 5, 10 years from now. What is that vision looking like for you guys?
I think we have a clear vision of how many tools we need to sell to which people at which time in order to have a fair and venture scalable exit. The real dream here is that our tool is installed in every single advanced materials manufacturing line in the world. And that tool is paired with software that we make that does advanced analytics to help manufacturers make decisions. And in many cases, even automatically makes those decisions for them. We really seriously envision a world as well where this technology is not only powerful enough to improve yields and performance, et cetera, but really to enable the manufacturing of a next generation version of advanced materials that no one else has been able to manufacture. One of the things that continuously motivates me at this company is, especially coming from academia, it's like every week there's a new paper that's like, hey, this new battery is 80% better than what exists. This new semiconductor is 90% better. This new solar cell is X% better. But no one can ever manufacture those things. So they stay in labs as like sort of hero experiments. We really do view our platform as this potentially transformational tool that can really enable this totally next generation of advanced materials and products.
That's fantastic. I had a question about your transition from a PhD student to a CEO. What surprised you the most?
The biggest shift I have had to do in my thinking is, I think in academia or in research, to say in general, your thinking is much more investigative. I always felt sort of investigating problems from like a bottoms up way. That's how that leads to accidental discoveries, etc. But in running a company, it's sort of the opposite. You need to provide this top down vision with these clear objectives and these clear milestones and this clear plan. And I was just legitimately not used to that style of thinking. It's really required here. And that's not to say there's no room for some sort of adjustment or some pivot or some deviation from a plan, etc. But you have to start with this top-down plan and vision and roadmap and assignments, etc., and then continuously evaluate and adjust that roadmap and plan if necessary. But you really need that there.
We went through this learning curve to kind of understand that we needed to define these well-defined devices, these very well-defined milestones, both for ourselves as well as for the company.
Any message to PhD students who are thinking about starting companies, anything that they should do differently?
I think that if you're thinking about doing it, you should just do it. I think if you spend the time to get a PhD, and the whole point of that really is to be an independent thinker, you should take some risk with that.
Make something out of it. Just don't publish and leave.
You've earned the right to take some risk. If you're a PhD student, you're used to living off a very low salary anyway.
All right, guys. This is fun. They're like small nuances and lessons that I learned. I enjoyed interacting with you, Jared and Ali, for some time now. Good luck with everything for you guys. And we'll hopefully talk more in a couple of years when you made a lot more progress. Good luck with everything.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.